The talk show host walked into the conversation thinking he had complete control, convinced that he would corner Pam Bondi with his sharp questioning. But in a matter of minutes, she flipped the script entirely, leaving him scrambling for response, struggling to regain his footing. The studio lights beamed down, hotter than she had anticipated, almost suffocating. Pam Bondi had been in the public eye for years, had stood behind podiums facing relentless reporters, debated high-stakes legal matters on live television, and faced down critics without breaking a sweat. But today felt different. There was something in the air, an underlying tension so thick it was almost visible. It wasn't just another interview. It was a setup. She adjusted the lapel of her blazer, making sure her posture was perfect, unshakable. Across from her sat Graham Layton, host of The Exchange, a man who prided himself on pushing his guests to their absolute limits. He was known for his aggressive questioning, his refusal to let anything slide, and his knack for turning an interview into a trial by fire. Pam had been invited under the pretense of discussing law, justice, and her tenure as Florida's Attorney General. But from the moment she stepped onto the stage, she could tell this wasn't going to be a discussion. It was an ambush. The energy in the room was sharp, cold, expectant. The audience wasn't just there to listen. They were waiting for a fight. She glanced at the sea of faces in the dimly lit crowd. Some leaned forward, eager for the confrontation they felt was coming. Others sat stiff, arms crossed, their skepticism apparent. The studio crew counted down from 3, 2, 1, and then click. The red recording light flickered on. Graham leaned in, his signature tight-lipped smirk in place, his eyes unreadable. "Pam, welcome to The Exchange." She returned a polite nod, unwavering. "Thank you for having me." His fingers drummed lightly against the desk. His tone was smooth, polished, yet edged with something sharper, something meant to provoke. "You've been at the center of controversy for quite some time. Your tenure as Attorney General, your political stances. Some would say your decisions have caused more harm than good. Would you say that's a fair assessment?" There it was. No warm-up, no small talk. Straight to the attack. Pam had dealt with this approach before, but there was something different about Graham's delivery. He wasn't asking for clarity. He wasn't looking for insight. He was laying a trap. And she knew the audience had caught onto it too. Keeping her expression neutral, her tone calm, she responded, "I'd say that's an oversimplification of years of work. But if you'd like to discuss specifics, I'd be happy to." Graham tilted his head slightly, lips curling into a practiced smirk. "Oh, we'll definitely get to specifics." He turned to the camera, shifting his attention to the viewers at home. "But let's start with something simple. A lot of people, especially those impacted by your policies, feel that you're out of touch with the realities of everyday Americans, that you've prioritized personal and political gains over doing what's right. Do you ever stop to think about the people on the other side of your decisions?" It wasn't an actual question, it was bait. Pam recognized the tactic immediately. He wanted a reaction, something emotional, something defensive. He wanted her to stumble, to hesitate, to give him a soundbite that could be played over and over. Instead, she folded her hands neatly on the desk and met his gaze. "Every decision I've made has been with the intent of upholding the law and protecting citizens. That doesn't mean everyone agrees with me. But leadership isn't about popularity. It's about doing what's necessary, even when it's not the easiest choice." Graham let out a small chuckle, shaking his head as if he had expected her to say that. "That's convenient," he mused, his voice dropping slightly. "But let's be honest, Pam." He leaned in now, his tone tightening. "Some would argue that you've turned a blind eye to justice when it suited you." The room shrank. The silence was suffocating. Pam remained still, heartbeat steady. She had seen this game played before. Force an emotional response. Make the guest flustered. Get them on the defensive. She wasn't falling for it. Instead, she took a slow, measured breath and met his gaze head-on. "You seem eager to make this personal, Graham. I'd hope you'd actually allow me to answer your questions instead of just throwing out accusations." A ripple ran through the audience, small murmurs, shifting postures. Graham's expression flickered, just for a second, But it was there. A crack. A miscalculation. But he wasn't backing down. If anything, he was about to make things even messier. He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other like he was settling in for a performance. Let's talk about power, Pam. His voice had that sharp edge again. People in your position, politicians, prosecutors, you all claim to serve justice. But it seems that justice often bends in favor of those who already hold influence. Pam didn't move, didn't react. She let him continue. For example, he went on, glancing down at the stack of papers in front of him. When you were Attorney General, there were claims that certain corporate donors received special treatment. Investigations disappeared. People who should have been held accountable somehow walked away untouched. Can you look this audience in the eye and say that never happened? A classic trap. A simple no would be met with skepticism. A yes would be twisted into a confession. It was calculated, designed to put her in a corner. Pam exhaled through her nose, voice unwavering. Graham, if you're going to make accusations, at least have the integrity to be specific. What cases are you referring to? Graham smirked, turning to the camera once more, playing to the viewers. Oh, we'll get specific. Don't worry. A few chuckles rippled through the audience, but it wasn't the light-hearted kind. It was the kind that came before a storm. Pam could feel the energy shifting. He was painting her into a corner, creating the illusion that she was struggling under pressure. But in reality, she hadn't even started pushing back. He flipped through the papers dramatically, a prop meant to create the illusion of incriminating evidence. Let's start with this, he said, eyes glinting. Back when you were in office, there was a lawsuit against a certain corporation, one of your donors, mind you, accused of fraudulent business practices. And then suddenly, that lawsuit vanished. What a coincidence. Pam pressed her lips together. Now she knew exactly what he was twisting. She opened her mouth to respond, but Graham cut her off. Tell me, Pam, why should the American people believe that politicians like you don't just protect the wealthy while the rest of us get left behind? The question landed like a gut punch. The murmurs in the audience grew. Graham's eyes lit up. This was the moment he had been waiting for. A loaded question, meant to force her into a headline-worthy quote. He thought he had her, but he underestimated her. Pam inhaled deeply, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him feel it. Then, finally, she leaned in slightly. You know, Graham, it's fascinating how you frame things. He blinked barely, but she caught it. But that would make for a very exciting headline, would it? The audience shifted, murmurs rippling through the crowd. Pam could feel it. The weight in the room had started to tilt. The certainty that Graham Layton had walked in with? It was slipping. But he wasn't finished. He never was. Graham was a seasoned interviewer, a master at keeping control, at steering the conversation where he wanted. He wasn't the type to get rattled. If he felt the momentum turning against him, he knew how to recalibrate, how to press harder, how to regain the upper hand. His smirk widened, his confidence still intact. So, you're saying money never, ever influenced any of your decisions? Pam held his stare, unmoved, unbothered. I'm saying facts did. And I find it interesting that instead of discussing those facts, you'd rather insinuate corruption without any proof. A sharper murmur ran through the crowd. Some people nodded, others remained skeptical, arms crossed, but the shift was undeniable. The once unshakable certainty that Graham was winning this exchange? It wasn't so clear anymore. He could feel it too. So he changed tactics. And that's where he made his biggest mistake. Graham adjusted in his chair, his demeanor shifting, his tone becoming almost casual, conversational. Let's put politics aside for a moment, he said smoothly. Let's talk about character. Pam didn't move. She knew exactly where this was going. Graham tilted his head slightly, his voice taking on a calculated softness. You've built a reputation as a tough prosecutor, a woman who stands by her principles. But what happens when those principles only seem to apply when it's convenient? The air in the room tightened. The audience was locked in. Graham leaned forward, voice dripping with feigned curiosity. You talk about justice, about fairness under the law, but do you remember the protests outside that movie theater in Tampa? Because a lot of people do. A shift. A subtle but noticeable change in the crowd's posture. Pam did remember. It had been a sweltering summer evening. She had gone to see a documentary, nothing political, nothing controversial. But outside the theater, a group of protesters had been waiting. Angry. Seething. They shouted insults. Called her a disgrace. Accused her of ignoring their struggles. And then, just as she was walking past, one of them spat at her. The moment had been caught on camera, spread across social media like wildfire. Some people called it justified outrage. Others called it what it really was, assault. Pam's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice remained controlled. Yes, I remember. Graham leaned in, his voice laced with something almost gleeful. People were angry. Some of them had lost everything because of policies you defended. And instead of engaging, you walked away. Some would say that's cowardly. A murmur swept through the audience. The trap was set. Pam felt the familiar frustration rise. Graham wasn't after the truth. He was after the most scandalous version of it. She exhaled slowly. And then, without breaking eye contact, she struck back. Let's be very clear, Graham. You're talking about a situation where I was harassed in public, where I was physically assaulted. Are you suggesting I should have just stood there and taken it? The room tensed. Graham's eyebrows lifted slightly, caught off guard by the directness of her question. Pam pressed forward, her voice sharper now. Because if you are, I'd love to hear you say it. Plainly. Let's not dance around it. Let's hear you defend mob intimidation on national television. Silence. For the first time, Graham hesitated. The audience was no longer just watching a guest on the defensive. They were watching a host, one who had just been called out. He shifted slightly, adjusting his papers, but quickly regained his composure. I'm saying that when people are desperate, they do desperate things. And when leaders refuse to engage with them, they feel abandoned. Pam didn't blink. Desperation doesn't justify violence. Would you say the same if it had been someone else in my position? If it had been a journalist? Or a politician you agree with? Or do different rules apply depending on the target? A stir rippled through the audience. Graham exhaled through his nose, irritation flickering in his expression. So, you're playing the victim now? Pam leaned back slightly. I don't have to. The footage speaks for itself. But if you'd like to have a real conversation about the actual issues instead of twisting events for drama, I'd be happy to. A beat of silence. Graham shifted, flipping to a new page in his notes. But the energy in the room had changed. Pam wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was taking control. And Graham hated it. He inhaled sharply, glancing down at his notes, as if recalibrating. The cracks in his confidence were subtle, but they were there. He wasn't used to losing control of an interview. Pam, on the other hand, she was watching, waiting, ready. But Graham wasn't giving up. If a personal attack hadn't shaken her, he'd go for something bigger. He set his papers down, laced his fingers together, and fixed Pam with a look that was almost pitying. All right, let's be honest here, Pam. You have a history of defending people and policies that, frankly, a majority of Americans find problematic. If you weren't in politics, if you didn't have power, do you really think you'd be standing here today? Or would you just be another person left behind by the very system you upheld? It was a clever pivot, a way to make her seem out of touch, privileged, detached from the struggles of everyday Americans. But Pam saw right through it. She tilted her head slightly. That's an interesting argument, Graham. You're saying that because I worked within the system, I somehow don't understand it. Graham smirked, sensing an opening. I'm saying you benefited from it. Pam leaned forward. You seem to have a lot of opinions about my past, she said smoothly. So let me ask you something. What's your definition of justice? His smirk faltered. Excuse me? She gestured toward him. You sit here implying corruption. Implying favoritism. Implying that I, got where I am because of privilege? So tell me, how do you define justice? Is it about who shouts the loudest? Who makes the most accusations? Or is it about facts? Graham's lips parted slightly, as if searching for a response. Pam didn't give him a chance. Because, Graham, if you're so confident that the system is broken, I'd love to hear your solution. You've had plenty of time to criticize me. But what exactly would you do differently? Silence. A slow murmur rippled through the audience. Graham's fingers curled slightly against the desk. His jaw tensed. That's not my job, Pam. She nodded.
Exactly.
Your job is to stir controversy, to frame things a certain way, to make people think there's always a scandal, always a conspiracy. But let's be real, you don't actually care about justice. You care about making a spectacle. The audience reacted immediately, gasps, murmured agreement. Graham blinked. His composure, for the first time, cracked. Pam sat back. So, if we're done playing games, I'd love to actually talk about the issues. But if you just want sound bites, let me know. I'd hate to waste your time. The tension in the studio was suffocating. For the first time since the interview started. When a host loses control, how Pam Bondi flipped the script on live TV. The moment was supposed to be his. The audience had been with him from the start, leaning in, hanging on his words. He knew how to work a crowd, how to set the stage. But that wouldn't make for a very exciting headline, would it?
A shift.
Subtle at first. A murmur. A glance exchanged between audience members. The weight in the room had begun tilting, and Graham could feel it. But he wasn't done. He never expected an easy interview. He thrived on pushing, pressing, making his guests sweat. And Pam? She wasn't about to roll over. So he leaned in. Are you saying money never, ever influenced any of your decisions? Pam met his stare. I'm saying facts did. And I find it interesting that instead of discussing those facts, you'd rather insinuate corruption, without a shred of proof. A flicker in the audience. Some nodding. Some still wary. But the tide wasn't as firmly in Graham's favor anymore. He knew it too. So, he changed tactics. And that's when he made his biggest mistake. The setup. Graham's smile widened, not friendly, but calculated. If politics wasn't enough to rattle her, he had another card to play. Let's put politics aside for a moment. Let's talk about character. Pam didn't react. She knew where this was going. You've built a reputation as a tough prosecutor, a woman of principle. But what happens when those principles only seem to apply when it's convenient? The audience tensed. You talk about justice, he continued, voice dripping with feigned curiosity. Fairness. But do you remember the protests outside that movie theater in Tampa? Oh, she remembered. A summer night. A documentary. Nothing political. Nothing controversial. But outside, a crowd waited. They shouted insults. Called her a disgrace. Accused her of turning her back on them. And then someone spat at her. It was caught on camera, circulated for days. Some called it justified outrage. Others called it assault. Pam's jaw tightened ever so slightly. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. Yes, I remember. Graham leaned in. People were angry. Some lost everything because of policies you defended. And instead of engaging, you walked away. Some would say that's cowardly. A murmur rippled through the audience. Pam exhaled slowly. She had seen this game before. Let's be clear, Graham. You're talking about a situation where I was harassed, where I was physically assaulted. Are you suggesting I should have just stood there and taken it? Graham hesitated. Pam pressed forward. Because if you are, say it plainly. Let's hear you defend mob intimidation on national television. Silence. For the first time, the audience wasn't just watching a guest on the defensive. They were watching a host get called out. The second mistake. Graham's fingers tapped lightly on the desk, a sign he was recalibrating. He wasn't used to losing control. Pam, on the other hand, she was steady, watching, waiting. So, Graham pivoted again. All right, let's be honest. You've defended people and policies that many Americans find problematic. If you didn't have power, if you weren't in politics, do you really think you'd be sitting here today? Or would you be just another person left behind by the very system you upheld? A clever move, designed to make her look out of touch, privileged. Pam saw right through it. She tilted her head slightly. Interesting argument. You're saying that because I worked within the system, I somehow don't understand it. Graham smirked. I'm saying you benefited from it. Pam leaned forward. You seem to have a lot of opinions about my past.
So let me ask you something.
What's your definition of justice? Graham blinked. Excuse me? She gestured toward him. You sit here implying corruption, favoritism, that I somehow dodged accountability. So tell me, how do you define justice? Is it about who shouts the loudest? Who stirs the most controversy? Or is it about facts? Graham's lips parted slightly, searching for a response. Pam didn't give him a chance. Because if you're so confident the system is broken, I'd love to hear your solution. You've had plenty of time to criticize me. But what exactly would you do differently? Silence. The audience murmured. Graham's fingers curled slightly against the desk. That's not my job, Pam. She nodded.
Exactly.
Your job is to stir controversy.
To frame things a certain way.
To make people think there's always a scandal. But let's get real. You don't actually care about justice. You care about making a spectacle. A ripple of gasps. A few murmured approvals. For the first time, Graham blinked, his composure slipping. Pam leaned back. So, are we here to have a real discussion? Or are we just here to create a headline? The moment everything changed, Graham glanced at the producer, searching for an out. There wasn't one. The room wasn't hanging on his words anymore. It was hanging on hers. And then, from the back of the audience, a single clap. Then another. And another. The applause wasn't deafening, but it didn't have to be. Because in that moment it was clear. Pam Bondi had just won. Graham swallowed, straightened his papers, just to keep his hands busy. He forced a smile. Well, Pam, you've certainly made an impression here today. She met his gaze. I tend to do that. Irritation flickered across his face, but he covered it quickly. He knew he had to wrap things up, without making it obvious that he had lost control. That's all the time we have. I appreciate you coming on. Pam nodded. I appreciate the opportunity. Next time, maybe we can have an actual discussion instead of a performance. The audience chuckled. Graham forced a strained smile, but didn't respond. He turned to the camera, his voice tighter than before. That was Pam Bondi, former Attorney General of Florida. We'll be right back. The aftermath. The second the recording light shut off, Graham rubbed the bridge of his nose. Pam stood, smoothing her blazer. If you ever decide you want a real conversation, let me know. Graham scoffed. I ask the questions people want answered. She smiled.
No.
You ask the questions that get clicks. And with that, she walked off set. By the time she stepped outside, her phone was blowing up. Hashtag Pam Bondi Unfiltered was already trending. Clips of the interview had spread like wildfire. Some called it a masterclass in handling pressure. Others said she had exposed the media game for what it was. There were critics, of course. There always were. But the narrative was clear. Pam Bondi hadn't just survived the interview. She had owned it.